Transplasticity and the Ontology of Race and Species by Kajia Min. During the 1920s, French surgeon Sergei Voronov became an international sensation for his technique of grafting chimpanzee testicular matter into human testicles. Incredible as it may seem today, monkey glands were all the rage among elite European men, and Voronov's operation was a topic of obsessive interest in the press and in popular fiction alike. For example, Félicien Champsar's 1929 popular speculative fiction novel, Nora, La Grignon Devenue Femme, Nora, the Ape Woman, imagines the possibilities of human-ape ontological and erotic proximity suggested by Voronov's practice of gland xenotransplantation, or trans-species transplantation. This article puts Nora and the early 20th century, the early 1900s, science of ductless glands, ovaries, testicles, thyroid, thalamus, etc., into conversation with trans new materialist science studies around their shared investment in plasticity. While the term plasticity emerged from the neurosciences and stem cell research, I use it in this article to refer broadly to the capacity of bodily tissues to develop, regenerate, and otherwise transform themselves in dynamic relation to matter, technology, and the environment. Plasticity, thus understood, names one of new materialism's key investments. It is the organic version of vibrant matter itself. Glandular science, which would later be derided by endocrinologists as snake medicine, was in essence a science of organic plasticity and its therapeutic uses. It held the ductless glands, particularly the ovaries and testicles, to be the vital activators of bodily plasticity, stimulating growth, development, sexual differentiation, and even intelligence. This article takes shape around the monkey gland operation's new materialist challenge to species ontologies. The procedure affirmed humans and apes to be composed of vitally compatible organic substances, to such an extent that a bit of ape testicle, or an ape ovary for that matter, might reactivate the lost plasticity of aged human bodies. The bygone science and speculative fiction of monkey gland operations might therefore serve as a laboratory in which the claims of new materialist and post-humanist trans theory might be tested. This turn in trans theory is most clearly delineated in Eva Hayward and Jamie Weinstein's introduction to a special issue of TSQ on tranimalities. This introduction positions trans, an assemblage of all words containing the prefix trans, as central to contemporary debates in post-humanist and animal studies scholarship. For Hayward and Weinstein, unlike transgender or trans asterisk does not reference a distinct form of gendered or sexed personhood and thus makes no claims on ontology. Instead, trans asterisk is the very moving mattering that constitutes being. Trans, thus understood, is another name for what scholars contributing to the ontological turn have called affect, vibrant matter, and yes, plasticity. It denotes the excitations, intensifications, and movements through, within, and across matter, because trans as a prefix is always prepositional, always in transformative relation to something else, invisible to those who would misperceive matter and organisms to be inert, enclosed, self-same, and classifiable. Trans thus at once precedes ontology and troubles ontologized states, such as those that separate male from female, human from animal, and human from technology or environment. Transing, the gerund form, names this process of troubling taxonomy, usually by crossing or entangling two or more categories of ontologized being. As in most ontological scholarship in affect studies and new materialism, vitalism, which here goes by the name trans, generates scholarly hope. Trans, Hayward and Weinstein write, is movement, excitation, and intensification, or a motor of internal instability that drives self-overcoming, unpredictability, and irreducible multiplicity. Trans, exemplified in the plastic and generative capacities of matter, is at once that quasi-mystical force that generates being, and that unpredictable movement that destabilizes taxonomy, selfhood, and ontology. In the latter guise, trans offers an antidote to the ills of the imperialist mania for classification whose chief product is, for animal studies, the human itself. in its foundational disavowal of animality, and, for Wintterian scholars of race, the misrepresentation of man in his white Western humanist guise as the sole genre of the human. In the beginning is trans, writes Claire Colebrook. If trans, or for Colebrook, transvestivity, is indeed primary, then race, gender, sexuality, and so on are but rough, clumsy, post facto attempts to capture and classify a plasticity that will always exceed such categories. By centering the primary plasticity and vibrancy of matter, which fails to respect human-made divisions of gender, race, and species, trans-new materialism seeks to undo the harms of humanist taxonomies while envisioning more expansive modes of inter-influence and transformation. This offers a potentially huge payoff for a range of scholarly fields. Nevertheless, I have two concerns, which this article more fully excavates. The first is that, in this affirmation of trans as the primary vitality underlying all being and all life, vitality and its theoretical avatars, plasticity, affect, and movement, go unquestioned as scholarly values. This is the case because vitality, as a pre-ontological and therefore pre-discursive force, is imagined to exist prior to power. Hence, while transgender may well be a handmaiden to colonial racial taxonomies of the human, trans is imagined to be exempt from such ontologies of a different order altogether. By contrast, scholars working in a Foucauldian frame would understand vitality, life, and other allied terms as invested from the start by biopower, a form of power that takes life as its object. I concur with such scholars that vitality, life, plasticity, affect, trans are foundational, rather than prior to, humanist racialized divides between human and animal or being and non-being. Second, a simple but oft overlooked point, if trans is that dynamic process through which thingness and beingness are constituted, then this means that trans generates ontology. As forces that generate ontological differentiation, trans and transing cannot be unambivalent antidotes to the ills of ontology and taxonomy. This article turns to monkey gland science and science fiction to flesh out these claims. Glandular science literalizes transing. As I will elaborate below, its signature technology was the vitalizing transplantation of biomatter across the ontological divides of sex and species. Conceptually, its affirmation of human-ape transspecies plasticity undoes ontological divisions between humans and apes. However, the speculative fiction I study demonstrates that such human-animal transings were tethered to the ontology of race. Building on Eva Hayward and Shay Gossett's claim that the human-animal divide is a racial and colonial divide, this article zeroes in on the process by which race and animality were produced in relation to each other. In doing so, it contributes to the burgeoning inquiry into transsex, tranimal, and transspecies plasticity, which I refer to, jointly, as transplasticity, while interrogating the affirmative and even utopian valence of such inquiry. Transplasticity describes the capacity of organic matter to transform itself in ways that transgress ontological divides between sex, race, and species. As a corrective to the new materialist tendency to focus on the conceptual possibilities of plasticity, I attend to the uses of transplasticity, asking what transplasticity does. As precursors to transgenic organisms, medical gender affirmation procedures, and the new materialist interest in plasticity as an index of transformative organic agency, early 20th century, early 1900s, gland transplantations have much to tell us about the historical and racial genealogies of technologies and concepts that today seem freighted with political and conceptual potential. My approach combines the history of science with plot analyses of speculative fiction texts. Speculative fiction unlocks the speculative and unfinished dimensions of a juncture of the history of science that was pregnant with futurity in its own time, but was soon discredited by the institutionalization of endocrinology as a legitimate science. Fiction also allows for a crucial exploration of the emotions and sensations evoked by the possible and probable futures of new scientific and medical techniques. Voronoff's monkey gland operations activated racialized fantasies, anxieties, and ambitions regarding human-simian recombinations that are best studied not in medical textbooks themselves, but rather in the cultural fictions they inspired. I turn to Shamsar's Nora and H.G. Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau, 1896, to envision both the arrested futures and the erotic unconscious of glandular science. Ultimately, I argue that gland xenotransplantation was a use of transplasticity that generated rather than troubled the ontobiological concepts of sexual, racial, and species difference. Glands and the plasticity of life. In the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, emerging theories of glandular secretions positioned the glands, especially the ovaries and testicles, as the mysterious source of messages that disseminated sexual difference throughout the body during puberty, governed the timing and the extent of growth and maturation, and eventually switched off, leading to the body's withering and loss of sexual differentiation with old age. Notably, the ovaries and testicles were not just envisioned as the biological source of sexual differentiation. Rather, glandular theories bound polar sex dimorphism to life itself by situating the glands as both the source of sexual differentiation and the motor of the life cycle of growth, maturation, and decay. Clearly dimorphic sexual difference was the key sign of healthy maturity, whereas its absence or fuzziness signaled the immaturity of childhood, the decay of old age, or the disability of gender inversion, incomplete or degenerate forms of human life. At the same time, sexual dimorphism and clear mental gender differentiation between men and women were being theorized as the unique evolutionary and civilizational achievement of the white races. Relative sexual difference positioned the races on the linear path of evolutionary fitness, just as it mapped the relative health, fitness, and maturity of white bodies. What were considered most exciting about glandular theories were their potential medical applications. As the vital principle of plasticity, healthy glands were capable of inducing growth and development, of activating bodies to reach sex dimorphic forms, and of stimulating, in some not yet understood way, the development of intelligence and good character. The 19th, 1800s, and early 20th, 1900s century, sciences primarily valued plasticity for the possibilities for eugenic population control and human engineering that it proffered. As the easily localized source of plasticity, the gland offers a quick fix, a means of correcting faulty bodies and minds. Clinicians sought to cure such maladies as homosexuality, impotence, overwork, criminality, and old age with the infusion of fresh glandular matter, leading to the pathologization of a host of new conditions. However, in the moment before the chemical structures of estrogen and testosterone were isolated and replicated, the agent of plasticity was not yet fully liquid. While ovarian secretions could be derived from large quantities of the urine of pregnant human or equine females, testicular secretions remained housed within the form of solid organs. Sourcing testicular secretions was therefore a major problem. Unfortunately, fresh human testicles were in short supply, given the reluctance of humans to part with them. In France, laws prohibited use of the cadavers of executed prisoners for medical science, barring French surgeons from what was a major source of glandular raw material in the United States. Gland therapies were therefore tranimalities from the very start. Ovarian secretions were extracted from horse urine, and slurries of goat and bull testicle were injected and consumed to enhance and restore youthful cis-manhood and cis-womanhood. One of the most sensational applications, however, was the infamous monkey gland operation. Popularized by Voronoff in Paris, the operation consisted of grafting a sliver of chimpanzee testicle into a bisected human testicle. Voronoff believed that because, according to Darwin's theory of evolution, anthropoid apes were biologically close to humans, ape xenotransplants would take, and the healthy young ape testicle would reawaken the slumbering human testicle, revitalizing it to the high level of function thought to characterize peak maturity. The predominant use of glandular transplants was to rejuvenate men and women according to cis-normative and dimorphic models of idealized white gender difference. Nevertheless, glandular science was also transsex from the very start. The agency of the glands rather than the nerves in producing sexual maturation was evidenced by Eugene Steinek's cross-sex transplantation of ovaries or testicles in castrated, immature rats or guinea pigs. These transplantations caused the rats and guinea pigs to sexually mature and, in Steinek's interpretation, to exhibit behavioral characteristics associated with the sex of the transplanted glands rather than their birth sex. In 1940, 47-year-old Lily Elbe, who had lived most of her life as the male painter Einar Wegener, received first the ovaries of a young woman and, later, perhaps a uterus in an effort to allow her to fully inhabit her youthful female self. She is thought to have died of complications from the latter experimental surgery. In a parallel procedure, Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science used transplanted testicular tissue to help patients transition to male. According to Hayward, however, the first documented human gender transition surgery was actually trans-specific, involving the transplantation of non-human ovaries into a human trans woman. Nor is this enmeshment of trans species with transsex becoming a thing of the distant past. Until recently, Premarin, an estrogen made of the urine of pregnant mares, was a standard prescription for transitioning women, leading Hayward to wonder, in an autoethnographic vein, if my conjugated equine estrogens are reshaping my species, becoming horse, along with my sex. Could mare chemistry be interlacing my own, giving me more of an insight into horse perception than sex perception? These medical applications of glandular science offer concrete examples of transplasticity in action. Here we have a series of material traversals of the ontological categories of human and animal, as well as male and female. As Mel Chen writes, in the New Natures of Transspecies Biology, including both transgenic stem cell research and the use of animal byproducts and hormones to alter sexual and reproductive function in humans, animals are not a third term. Instead, humans and non-human animals recombine sexually within the same ontological form in which they are sometimes admitted to belong. Material recombinations of human and non-human animal, in new transgenic as in old glandular research, rely on and activate plasticity, the ability of bodies to transform in response to molecules and transplanted tissue from other species. Transspecies and transsex plasticity were foundational to the endocrinological science that would, by the 1950s, undergird transsexuality as a diagnostic category and set of medical protocols. Yet such transplasticity does not necessarily result in an opening of possibilities for new ethics or forms of life beyond the categories of sexually dimorphic Eurohumanism. This is to make a simple but I think crucial point. Sometimes what transing does is shore up and, in some cases, empirically produce the very boundaries that are being crossed. The hallowed origins of biological sexual difference were sought, empirically speaking, through the method of transsex organ transplantation. Transplasticity generates sexed ontology. But might transplasticity trouble ontology as well? In what follows, I turn to works of speculative fiction to envision both the arrested futures and the erotic unconscious of glandular science and Darwinian evolution.